The words sliced through me like broken glass. "You're just the babysitter, Maya. Remember your place." My sister-in-law Jessica stood in my own kitchen, pointing her manicured finger at me while my two children cowered behind my legs. I never imagined that single moment of cruelty would trigger a chain of events that would expose her dark secrets and nearly destroy my family. But sometimes the universe has a way of serving justice when you least expect it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other Tuesday in our small suburban home in Riverside. I was making breakfast for Emma, my 8-year-old, and little Jake, who had just turned 5. The smell of pancakes filled the air as I flipped them on the griddle, trying to make them perfect circles the way Jake liked them. Emma was at the kitchen table, carefully coloring in her homework worksheet, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration the way she always did when she was focused. My husband David had left early for his construction job, kissing me goodbye in the dim morning light before the kids were even awake. We'd been married for 10 years, and while money was always tight, we had built something beautiful together. Our house wasn't fancy, a modest 3-bedroom ranch with creaky floors and windows that stuck when it rained, but it was filled with laughter and love. The walls were covered with Emma's artwork and Jake's finger paintings, and every corner held memories of birthday parties, Christmas mornings, and quiet family dinners. I worked part-time at the local library, shelving books and helping patrons find what they needed. It wasn't glamorous work, but it allowed me to be home when the kids got off the school bus, to make them snacks and help with homework. David and I had made the conscious choice that one of us would always be available for Emma and Jake. We'd both grown up in homes where parents were always working, always absent, and we were determined to do things differently. That particular Tuesday, I was expecting Jessica around 10 o'clock. She had called the night before, her voice tight with that familiar edge of superiority that I'd grown accustomed to over the years. "Maya, I need to discuss some family matters with you. I'll be over tomorrow morning." She never asked if it was convenient, never inquired about my schedule. Jessica simply announced her intentions and expected the world to rearrange itself accordingly. Jessica was David's older sister, and from the moment I'd met her 12 years ago, she'd made it clear that she didn't think I was good enough for her baby brother. She was everything I wasn't, tall and perfectly put together, with blonde hair that never seemed out of place, and clothes that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She lived in a massive house across town with her husband Robert, who worked in finance and drove a different luxury car every few years. They had no children, a choice Jessica often reminded everyone was deliberate and sophisticated. "Robert and I are focused on building wealth and traveling," she would say at family gatherings, her eyes scanning our modest surroundings with barely concealed disdain. "Some people are meant for different things." The implication was always clear: we were the breeders, the simple ones who chose responsibility over ambition. As I poured orange juice into plastic cups that morning, I found myself wondering what family matters Jessica needed to discuss. David's father had passed away 6 months earlier, leaving behind a small inheritance that we'd assumed would be divided equally between David and Jessica. But knowing Jessica, there was probably some complication, some way she'd found to maximize her share while minimizing ours. Emma looked up from her coloring. "Mama, is Aunt Jessica coming today?" There was something in her voice, a hesitancy that made my heart clench. My children were naturally friendly and outgoing, but they'd learned to be cautious around Jessica. She had a way of making them feel small, of correcting their grammar or commenting on their clothes in ways that felt like criticism disguised as concern. "Yes, sweetheart, she'll be here for a little while this morning," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "But after she leaves, we can work on that puzzle you've been wanting to finish." Jake bounced in his chair, syrup already sticky on his fingers, despite my attempts to keep him clean. "Can we go to the park later, Mama? Please? Tommy said there are new swings." "We'll see, baby. Let's get through our morning first." I ruffled his dark hair, so much like David's, and marveled at how these two perfect little humans had somehow chosen me to be their mother. Being their mom was the most important job I'd ever had, more meaningful than any career I might have pursued. At exactly 10 o'clock, Jessica's silver Mercedes pulled into our driveway. Through the kitchen window, I watched her check her reflection in the rearview mirror, applying lipstick with practiced precision. She stepped out wearing what looked like a designer pantsuit, her heels clicking against the concrete as she approached our front door. Emma and Jake had settled in the living room with their toys, Emma reading a picture book to her little brother. They looked up expectantly when Jessica entered, offering shy smiles that she barely acknowledged. "Hello, children," she said coolly as if they were strangers rather than her niece and nephew. "Hi, Aunt Jessica," Emma said politely, the way David and I had taught her to greet adults. Jake waved enthusiastically, still young enough to hope for warmth that never came. "Maya, we need to talk privately," Jessica announced, setting her expensive handbag on our coffee table with a decisive thud. "This is adult business." I glanced toward the children, who had already learned to make themselves invisible when Jessica was around. "Emma, sweetie, why don't you and Jake go play in your rooms for a little while? I'll call you when Aunt Jessica leaves." As they gathered their toys and headed down the hallway, I noticed Emma's protective hand on Jake's shoulder, the way she guided him away from whatever tension was building in our living room. At 8 years old, she was already learning to shield her little brother from adult complications, and it broke my heart that she felt that responsibility. Jessica settled onto our worn couch, her posture rigid and judgmental. Her eyes swept across our modest furnishings, the children's drawings taped to the refrigerator, the stack of library books on the side table. I could practically hear her mental inventory of everything she found lacking. "Coffee," I offered, more out of habit than genuine hospitality. "No, thank you. I don't have much time." She opened her handbag and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. "We need to discuss Dad's estate. Here it comes," I thought. The complicated legal maneuvering, the reasons why David and I wouldn't be getting what we'd been promised. I sat across from her in the armchair that David and I had bought secondhand when we were first married, its familiar embrace offering little comfort in the face of Jessica's cold efficiency. "As you know, Dad left the house and the majority of his assets to be divided between David and me," she began, her tone suggesting she was explaining something to a child. "However, there are some conditions that need to be met." I waited, my hands folded in my lap, trying to project a calm I didn't feel. David's father had been a kind man, someone who'd welcomed me into the family with genuine warmth. He'd spent countless afternoons in this very living room, reading stories to Emma and Jake, teaching them card games, and sharing tales of his own childhood. The idea that his final wishes might be complicated by Jessica's machinations felt like a betrayal of his memory. The will specifies that beneficiaries must demonstrate financial responsibility and stable family environments. Jessica continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering unfortunate news. "Given David's employment situation and your family's financial struggles, Robert and I have some concerns." "What kind of concerns?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Jessica's smile was sharp and predatory. "Well, for starters, David's been laid off twice in the past 5 years. Your combined income barely covers basic expenses. And frankly, Maya, your role as a part-time library employee hardly demonstrates the kind of ambition and success Dad valued." The words hit me like physical blows. David's layoffs hadn't been his fault. They were victims of an economy that treated construction workers as disposable. And my choice to work part-time wasn't from lack of ambition, it was a deliberate decision to prioritize our children's well-being over financial gain. "We're managing just fine," I said, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. "The kids are happy and healthy, David's working steadily now, and we've never missed a mortgage payment." "Barely managing isn't the same as thriving," Jessica replied, shuffling through her papers with theatrical efficiency. "Dad's will includes provisions for the welfare of his grandchildren. Emma and Jake deserve better than this." She gestured vaguely around our living room, dismissing years of love and care with a wave of her manicured hand. I felt my composure slipping. Better than what? A home where they're loved and cared for. Parents who prioritize their well-being over material possessions. "Maya, please don't take this personally. I'm simply looking out for the children's best interests." Her voice dripped with false concern. "Robert and I have been discussing this extensively. We believe Emma and Jake would benefit from a more structured environment, better educational opportunities, exposure to culture and refinement." The implication hung in the air between us like toxic smoke. Jessica was suggesting that my children would be better off with her, that David and I were somehow inadequate parents because we couldn't provide designer clothes and private schools. They're our children, Jessica. They're not up for discussion or redistribution based on bank account balances.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Now, I stood up, still holding Jake, feeling Emma's small hand grip my shirt. You just told my children that their mother is nothing more than hired help in their own home. You made my 5-year-old question whether I'm really his mama. Get out before I do something we'll both regret. For the first time in all the years I'd known her, Jessica looked uncertain. She quickly gathered her papers and stuffed them back into her folder, her movements sharp and agitated. This conversation isn't over, Maya. There are legal processes in motion that you can't stop by throwing a tantrum. Legal processes. I followed her toward the door, my children clinging to me like survivors of a storm. What are you talking about? Jessica paused at the door, her hand on the handle, and turned back with a smile that chilled me to the bone. Let's just say that concerned family members have options when children's welfare is at stake. Robert knows people, Maya, people who can investigate whether Emma and Jake are really getting the care they deserve. The implication hit me like a physical blow. She was threatening to call Child Protective Services, to use the system meant to protect children as a weapon against loving parents who simply didn't meet her financial standards. You wouldn't dare, I whispered. But even as I said it, I could see in her eyes that she absolutely would. Wouldn't I? Dad's will specifically mentions the welfare of his grandchildren. If David and I were to inherit everything, we'd be in a much better position to provide for Emma and Jake. Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made for the greater good. She left then, her heels clicking down our front walkway like countdown timers. I stood in the doorway, holding my children, watching her drive away in her expensive car, and feeling like our world had just shifted on its axis. Emma looked up at me with worried eyes that held too much understanding for an 8-year-old. Mama, what did Aunt Jessica mean? About you being a babysitter. I closed the door and sank down to their level, pulling both children into my arms. Jake was still sniffling, confused and hurt by the exchange he'd witnessed. Emma was trying to be brave, but I could see the fear in her expression. Sometimes grown-ups say hurtful things when they're angry. I said carefully, searching for words that would reassure without lying. Aunt Jessica was upset about some grown-up problems, and she said something very mean that she didn't mean. But you are a real mama, right? Jake asked again, his voice small and uncertain. Yes, baby, I'm your real mama. I was there when you were born. I've kissed every scraped knee. I've read you 1,000 bedtime stories. Nothing and no one can ever change that. Emma nodded solemnly, but I could see her processing the implications of what she'd heard. She was old enough to understand that Jessica had been threatening something, even if she didn't fully grasp what. Are we in trouble, Mama? Emma asked quietly. How do you explain to children that their own family member sees them as pawns in a larger game? How do you prepare them for the possibility that someone might try to tear apart the only life they've ever known? No, sweetheart, you and Jake aren't in trouble. You've done nothing wrong. I smoothed her hair, trying to project a calm I was far from feeling. Sometimes adults have disagreements about complicated things. But you never have to worry about whether Daddy and I love you, because we love you more than anything in the whole world. We spent the rest of the morning quietly, the children seeming to sense that something significant had shifted in our household. I made them lunch and tried to act normal, but my mind was racing. Jessica's threats weren't empty bluster. She had resources and connections that David and I lacked. If she was serious about involving child services, we could be facing a nightmare that would tear our family apart. When David came home that evening, exhausted and covered in construction dust, I waited until the children were in bed before telling him what had happened. He sat at our kitchen table, still in his work clothes, his face growing darker with each detail I shared. She said what to Jake? His voice was quiet and dangerous, the tone he used when he was truly angry. She made him question whether I'm really his mother, David. In his own home, she made him doubt the most basic truth of his existence. David's hands clenched into fists on the table. I should have seen this coming. She's always resented us, always thought she was better because of her money and her fancy house. But to go after the kids, she threatened to call CPS. I said quietly. She implied that concerned family members could raise questions about our fitness as parents. The color drained from David's face. We both knew stories of families torn apart by false accusations, of children removed from loving homes, based on nothing more than someone's vindictive phone call. The system was designed to err on the side of caution, which meant that even unfounded claims could result in investigations that would traumatize our children. She can't do that, David said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We're good parents. Anyone who knows us can see that. But Jessica doesn't know us, not really. She sees what she wants to see, a poor family struggling to get by. She can paint a picture of neglect and hardship that might sound convincing to someone who doesn't understand that love matters more than money. We stayed up late that night, talking through possibilities and worst-case scenarios. David called in sick to work the next day, and we spent the morning gathering documents, financial records, anything that might demonstrate our stability and competence as parents. We took pictures of our home, showing clean rooms and well-cared-for children's spaces. We made lists of references, people who could vouch for our character and our parenting. But even as we prepared for a fight we hoped would never come, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being reactive rather than proactive. Jessica had made the first move, establishing herself as the concerned family member, looking out for the children's best interests. We were already on the defensive, scrambling to prove our worth as parents to a system that might be inclined to believe the worst about people in our economic situation. 3 days passed in tense anticipation. David went back to work, but I found myself jumping every time the phone rang, checking and rechecking the locks on our doors. Emma and Jake seemed to sense the tension in our household, becoming quieter and more clingy than usual. On Friday afternoon, I was helping Emma with her math homework when the knock came. 3 firm raps on our front door that seemed to echo through the house like gunshots. I looked through the peephole and felt my blood turn to ice. A woman in a business suit stood on our porch, holding a clipboard and wearing the kind of serious expression that meant trouble. Behind her, I could see a county vehicle parked in our driveway. Child Protective Services had arrived. I took a deep breath and opened the door, my mind racing through everything David and I had discussed. Be cooperative but not defensive. Answer questions honestly but don't volunteer unnecessary information. Protect the children from as much of this as possible. Mrs. Maya Patterson, the woman asked, consulting her clipboard. Yes, that's me. I'm Sarah Martinez with Child Protective Services. We've received a report of concern regarding the welfare of Emma and Jake Patterson. May I come in? My heart was pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it, but I stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. Of course, the children are here. Emma's doing homework and Jake is playing in his room. Sarah Martinez was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with kind eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She moved through our living room with practiced efficiency, noting the children's artwork on the walls, the books scattered on the coffee table, the general state of organized chaos that defined our family life. Can you tell me about the nature of this report? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Sarah consulted her notes. We received a call from someone claiming to be a concerned family member. The caller alleged that the children were living in substandard conditions, that the parents were financially unstable, and that the mother was, let me see, acting more like a babysitter than a proper parent. The exact phrase Jessica had used. My sister-in-law had followed through on her threat, using the system designed to protect children as a weapon against us. I felt a surge of rage so intense that I had to grip the back of the couch to steady myself. I'd like to speak with the children separately, if that's all right, Sarah continued. And I'll need to see their bedrooms and the general condition of the home. Of course, Emma sweetheart, can you come here for a moment? Emma appeared in the doorway, her math homework still in her hand, looking curious and slightly worried. She was old enough to sense that this wasn't a normal visitor, that something serious was happening. Emma, this is Miss Martinez. She works for an organization that makes sure children are safe and happy. She'd like to ask you a few questions, okay? Emma nodded solemnly, her 8-year-old instincts telling her to be polite and cooperative. Sarah sat down on our couch and patted the cushion beside her, her manner warm and encouraging. Hi Emma, I love your artwork on the refrigerator. Did you draw those pictures yourself? Yes ma'am, that one's my family at the beach. even though we've never been to the beach. And that one's my dog, except we don't have a dog, but I really want one. Sarah smiled genuinely. Those are beautiful drawings. You're very talented. Can you tell me about your family? Who lives in your house? Mama and Daddy and me and Jake. Sometimes Uncle David comes over. He's Daddy's brother, but he doesn't have kids. And Grandpa used to come over a lot, but he died and it made Daddy really sad. I'm sorry to hear about your grandpa. It sounds like you have a nice family. How do your mom and dad take care of you?
Martinez, I'm here to learn about your family. Can you tell me about your mama and daddy? Jake launched into an enthusiastic description of our household, complete with dramatic reenactments of bedtime stories and detailed explanations of his favorite toys. When Sarah asked if he felt safe at home, he looked at her like she'd asked if the sky was blue. Of course I'm safe. Mama and Daddy keep me safe from monsters and strangers, and when I fall down, he paused, his expression growing more serious. But the mean lady made me sad. She said Mama was just babysitting. But Mama's not a babysitter. She's my real mama. Sarah's pen stopped moving across her notepad. What mean lady, Jake? Aunt Jessica. She came here and was mean to Mama and made her cry after she left. But Daddy said some people just have mean hearts and we should feel sorry for them. I felt a mixture of pride and fear. Jake had perfectly captured Jessica's visit, but I worried how Sarah would interpret his words. Would she see Jessica as a concerned family member trying to help, or would she recognize the malicious intent behind the report? Sarah spent another 30 minutes touring our home, checking the children's bedrooms, our kitchen, the overall cleanliness and safety of our living space. She made notes constantly, but her expression remained neutral and professional. Finally, she asked to speak with me privately, while the children went back to their activities. We sat at the kitchen table, and I tried to read her face for any indication of her impressions. Mrs. Patterson, I have to ask directly about the allegations that were made. The caller suggested that you and your husband were financially unstable and that the children might be neglected as a result. I took a deep breath. My husband works in construction, and yes, our income varies seasonally. But we've never missed a mortgage payment. The children have never gone hungry, and they receive regular medical and dental care. We may not have a lot of money, but we provide everything our children need. The caller also suggested that you weren't taking proper parental responsibility, that you were acting more like hired help than a mother. The phrase stung just as much the second time I heard it. I work part-time at the library, so that I can be home when the children get out of school. I help with homework, attend school events, volunteer in their classrooms when needed. I don't know what more parental responsibility could look like. Sarah nodded, making more notes. Can you tell me about your relationship with the person who made this report? Here was the moment of truth. I could try to downplay Jessica's hostility, make it sound like a simple family disagreement. Or I could tell the truth, and risk sounding vindictive and defensive. The caller was my sister-in-law, Jessica. She's been hostile toward our family for years because she believes we're beneath her social and economic status. She made the statement about me being just the babysitter during an argument about my father-in-law's estate. She was angry that David and I might inherit equally with her, despite having children to support. So you believe this report was made in retaliation rather than from genuine concern? I know it was. She said explicitly that she had connections who could investigate whether our children were getting proper care. She threatened to use CPS as a weapon against us for not accepting her authority over our family decisions. Sarah closed her notebook and looked at me directly. Mrs. Patterson, I want you to know that we take all reports seriously, but we also recognize when they're motivated by personal conflicts, rather than genuine welfare concerns. Based on my observation today, your children are clearly loved, well cared for, and thriving in your home. I felt tears of relief start to form, but I tried to maintain my composure. Does that mean this investigation is closed? I'll need to complete my report and have it reviewed by my supervisor, but I don't anticipate any further action being required. Your children are safe, healthy, and happy. That's what matters most. After Sarah left, I sat in my kitchen and cried. Not just from relief, but from anger and exhaustion and the realization that Jessica had put our entire family through hell, based on nothing more than her own jealousy and spite. She had weaponized a system meant to protect children, wasting resources that could have been used to help families in genuine need. When David came home that evening and I told him what had happened, his reaction was swift and decisive. "That's it. I'm calling Jessica right now and telling her exactly what I think of her little stunt." "Wait," I said, grabbing his arm as he reached for the phone. "Let me think about this for a minute." Something was crystallizing in my mind, a plan that went beyond simply defending ourselves against Jessica's attacks. She had shown her true nature, revealed the depths of her cruelty and manipulation. But she'd also made a crucial mistake. She'd left evidence of her intentions and her methods. "David, what if we don't just react to what Jessica did? What if we take control of this situation and make sure she can never hurt another family the way she tried to hurt ours?" My husband looked at me with a mixture of surprise and admiration. In all our years together, I'd always been the peacekeeper, the one who tried to smooth over conflicts and find compromise solutions. But Jessica had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She'd threatened our children and traumatized our family for her own selfish gain. "What did you have in mind?" David asked. I thought about Sarah Martinez, about how quickly she'd recognized that Jessica's report was motivated by malice rather than genuine concern. I thought about the other families who might not be so fortunate, who might not have obviously loving homes and articulate children to speak for them. Jessica thinks she can use her connections and her money to manipulate systems and hurt people. But she made one crucial error. She left a paper trail, and more importantly, she revealed her character to people who matter. Over the next several days, I began making phone calls, first to Sarah Martinez, asking about the process for reporting false CPS claims, and whether there were consequences for people who abused the system. Then to a legal aid clinic, learning about defamation laws and what constituted harassment. But the most important call I made was to Jessica's employer. It turned out that my sister-in-law worked as a consultant for a nonprofit organization that provided family services and advocacy. Her job literally involved helping vulnerable families navigate systems like child protective services, housing assistance, and financial aid programs. The irony was so thick I could taste it. I spent hours crafting a carefully worded letter to the nonprofit's board of directors. I didn't make accusations or demands for punishment. Instead, I simply provided a factual account of what had happened, including copies of text messages Jessica had sent David threatening to use her connections against us, documentation from CPS about the false report, and Sarah Martinez's findings that the allegations were unfounded and retaliatory. I concluded the letter with a simple observation. I thought the board should be aware that an employee who works with vulnerable families has demonstrated a willingness to weaponize child protective services against loving parents during a personal dispute. Other families might not be as fortunate as ours, in terms of being able to quickly demonstrate their fitness as parents. 3 weeks later, David received a text from Jessica. It was short and to the point. "I need to apologize for my behavior. Can we talk?" But by then, the consequences of her actions were already unfolding in ways she hadn't anticipated, and our story was far from over. The phone call came on a Thursday morning, while I was folding laundry in my bedroom. David had already left for work, and the kids were at school, so the house was unusually quiet. When I saw Jessica's name on the caller ID, my first instinct was to let it go to voicemail. We hadn't spoken since the CPS investigation 3 weeks ago, and I wasn't sure I trusted myself to remain civil. But curiosity won out. I wanted to know what had prompted her sudden desire to apologize, especially since I hadn't told David about the letter I'd sent to her employer. As far as Jessica knew, we were simply the same struggling family she'd always looked down on, the people who had somehow managed to slip through the cracks of her carefully orchestrated attack. "Hello, Jessica," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "Maya." Her voice sounded different, smaller somehow, stripped of the commanding authority she usually wielded like a weapon. "I need to talk to you. Can you meet me for coffee? There are things I need to explain, things you don't understand about the situation with Dad's will." I almost laughed at her presumption. Even now, even after what she'd put my family through, Jessica was operating under the assumption that I was too simple to understand complex situations, that there were adult matters beyond my comprehension. Jessica flinched as if I'd slapped her. "We thought, Robert convinced me that it would be temporary, that once you and David got back on your feet financially, everything would go back to normal." but the children would be safe and provided for in the meantime. I stared at her in amazement. Even now, even as she was supposedly apologizing and explaining, Jessica was trying to frame their scheme as somehow benevolent, as if traumatizing my children and tearing apart our family was an act of concern rather than greed. Jessica, do you have any idea what you almost did to Emma and Jake? Do you understand that children who are removed from loving homes, even temporarily, carry that trauma for the rest of their lives? I know it was wrong. But Maya, you have to understand the pressure we were under. Robert owes money to people who don't accept excuses or payment plans. They were threatening our house, our business, everything we'd worked for. The waitress appeared with our coffee, giving me a moment to process what Jessica was telling me. Her financial desperation didn't excuse her actions, but it did explain the calculated nature of her attack on our family. This hadn't been a momentary lapse in judgment or a family dispute that got out of hand. It had been a premeditated attempt to steal our inheritance and destroy our family in the process. What changed? I asked after the waitress left. Why are you telling me this now? Jessica's face crumpled slightly. Because it didn't work. The CPS investigation cleared you completely, and now there are other problems. Bigger problems. Such as, my supervisor at work called me into her office yesterday. Apparently they received a letter about my unprofessional conduct and my willingness to abuse child protective services for personal gain. Jessica looked at me with something that might have been respect mixed with fear. I don't suppose you know anything about that letter. I kept my expression neutral, though inside I felt a surge of satisfaction that my carefully worded correspondence had reached its intended target. I can't imagine why anyone would think your behavior was unprofessional. You work with vulnerable families, don't you? Helping them navigate systems like CPS. Maya, please. They're conducting an internal investigation. They've suspended me pending the outcome, and if they find evidence that I filed false reports or used my position inappropriately, I could lose my job entirely. And with Robert's business troubles, we can't afford for me to be unemployed right now. The irony was almost too perfect. Jessica, who had tried to weaponize the child welfare system against us, was now facing consequences from the very organization that employed her to help families in crisis. Her expertise in navigating social services, which she'd thought would give her an advantage in attacking us, was now working against her as her colleagues recognized the ethical violations she'd committed. I still don't understand why you're telling me this, I said carefully. What do you want from me? Jessica leaned forward, her desperation more obvious now. I need you to help me fix this. If you could write a letter to my supervisor explaining that our dispute was a family matter that got out of hand, that I wasn't acting maliciously but just got caught up in emotions about Dad's death and the inheritance. I almost choked on my coffee. You want me to lie for you? To cover up the fact that you deliberately filed a false CPS report to try to steal our inheritance. Not lie exactly, just reframe the situation. Emphasize that it was a misunderstanding. That no real harm was done since the investigation cleared you. The audacity was breathtaking. Jessica had put my family through weeks of terror, had made my 5-year-old question whether I was really his mother, had wasted government resources on a vindictive scheme to enrich herself, and now she wanted me to help her escape the consequences of her actions. Jessica, let me make sure I understand this correctly. You and Robert concocted a plan to have our children removed from our home so you could control Dad's entire estate. When that didn't work, you're now facing professional consequences for abusing your position. And you think the solution is for me to help you avoid responsibility for what you did. Maya, I know how it sounds, but you have to understand that if I lose my job, Robert and I could lose everything. The people he owes money to, they're not the type to accept bankruptcy or payment delays. We could be in real physical danger. I felt a moment of genuine pity for Jessica, followed immediately by anger that she was trying to manipulate my sympathy after what she'd put my family through. That's a terrible situation, Jessica. But it doesn't change the fact that you tried to destroy our family to solve your problems. I'm begging you, Maya. Please. I know I don't deserve your help after what I did, but I'm desperate. If there's any chance you could find it in your heart to write that letter. I looked across the table at my sister-in-law, this woman who had spent years treating me like an inferior, who had questioned my fitness as a mother and my worth as a person. She was asking me to save her from consequences that were entirely of her own making, to show mercy she had never extended to me or my family. "I need to think about this," I said finally. "This isn't a decision I can make right now, in a diner over coffee." Jessica nodded eagerly. "Of course, take all the time you need. But Maya, please remember that we're family. Despite everything that's happened, we're still family." Now she wanted to claim family loyalty, after years of treating David's side of the family like embarrassing relatives to be tolerated rather than loved. The selective nature of her appeals to family bonds would have been laughable if it weren't so pathetic. "I'll be in touch," I said, standing to leave. "But Jessica, I want you to understand something. The letter that went to your supervisor, it didn't contain any lies or exaggerations. It was simply a factual account of what you did and why you did it. If that letter is causing you professional problems, it's because your actions were genuinely unprofessional and unethical." I left Jessica sitting in the booth, staring into her untouched coffee cup, and drove home with my mind racing. The conversation had revealed so much more than I'd expected about the scope of their financial problems and the calculated nature of their attack on our family. But it had also presented me with an unexpected opportunity. That evening, after the children were in bed, I told David about my meeting with Jessica. His reaction was swift and predictable. "She wants you to what? Maya, please tell me you're not actually considering helping her after what she did to us." "I'm not considering helping her," I said carefully. "But I am considering how we might use this situation to ensure she can never hurt another family, the way she tried to hurt ours." David looked at me with the same mixture of surprise and admiration I'd seen when I first proposed taking action against Jessica. "What did you have in mind?" I had been thinking about it during the entire drive home from the diner. Jessica's desperation, combined with her admission of the calculated nature of their scheme, created an opportunity I hadn't anticipated. But it would require careful planning and perfect execution. "David, what if Jessica's problems could become our solution? Not just to protect ourselves, but to make sure she faces real consequences for what she did, while also preventing her from ever being in a position to hurt vulnerable families again." Over the next several days, I began researching Jessica's employer more thoroughly. The Riverside Family Advocacy Center was a well-respected nonprofit that provided services to low-income families, including help navigating child protective services, housing assistance, and educational advocacy. Jessica's role as a senior consultant meant she had direct contact with families in crisis, people who trusted her to help them rather than harm them. The more I learned about the organization's mission and values, the more appalled I became at Jessica's abuse of her position. She had used her professional knowledge of how CPS investigations work to craft a more convincing false report. She had leveraged her credibility as a family advocate to lend weight to her accusations. And she had done it all for money, showing complete disregard for the families she was supposed to serve. I also began researching Robert's business troubles, using public records and news articles to piece together the scope of their financial problems. What I found was even worse than Jessica had implied. Robert's investment firm was under investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for potential fraud. Several clients had filed complaints alleging that he had misappropriated their funds for high-risk investments without their knowledge or consent. The picture that emerged was of a couple who had been living well beyond their means for years, using Robert's position to access other people's money for increasingly desperate gambles. The inheritance from David's father wasn't just something they wanted, it was potentially the only thing standing between them and financial ruin, or even criminal charges. Armed with this information, I crafted a plan that went far beyond simply refusing to help Jessica escape consequences for her actions. If I was going to take action, I wanted it to be comprehensive and effective, something that would ensure justice while protecting other families from similar attacks. First, I contacted Sarah Martinez at Child Protective Services. David received a call, informing him that based on new information about Jessica's attempts to manipulate the inheritance through fraudulent means, she was being removed as a beneficiary of their father's estate entirely. Her share would be divided between David and a children's charity their father had supported, ensuring that his legacy would benefit kids who needed help rather than someone who had tried to harm them. The criminal investigation moved more slowly, but Sarah Martinez kept me informed of the progress. The district attorney's office was considering charges against Jessica for filing a false report, and the state licensing board was reviewing her professional credentials. Even if she avoided criminal prosecution, it was unlikely she would ever work in child or family services again. Throughout all of this, I made sure to protect Emma and Jake from the adult complexities of the situation. They knew that Aunt Jessica had been mean and was no longer welcome in our home, but they didn't need to understand the full scope of what she had tried to do to our family. My focus remained on ensuring their sense of security and stability, proving every day that they were loved and wanted and valued. The final piece of the puzzle came together when Robert's investment firm collapsed entirely. The SEC investigation had revealed the full extent of his fraudulent activities, and federal charges were filed against him for securities fraud and misappropriation of client funds. Jessica, who had risked everything to try to access inheritance money to solve their financial problems, now faced the prospect of being married to a federal criminal with no income and mounting legal bills. 3 months after that conversation in the diner, I received a letter from Jessica. It was handwritten on plain paper, a stark contrast to the expensive stationery she had always favored, and the content was unlike anything I had ever received from her. "Maya," it began, "I know I have no right to ask for your understanding or forgiveness, but I need to try to make you comprehend how sorry I am for what I did to your family. I lost sight of everything that mattered in my desperation to solve problems that seemed overwhelming at the time. I convinced myself that the end justified the means, that somehow traumatizing your children and destroying your family was acceptable if it meant Robert and I could survive financially." The letter went on for several pages, detailing her regret and acknowledging the full scope of the harm she had tried to cause. She didn't ask for mercy or help, and she didn't try to minimize her actions or shift blame to Robert's influence. For the first time in all the years I had known her, Jessica was taking full responsibility for her choices and their consequences. "I understand now that I was never entitled to judge your family or your parenting," she wrote near the end. "Emma and Jake are lucky to have parents who put their welfare above everything else, including family politics and financial pressures. I hope someday they can forgive me for the fear and confusion I caused them, even though I know I don't deserve their forgiveness any more than I deserve yours." I showed the letter to David, and we talked about whether we should respond. Part of me felt sympathy for Jessica's situation, understanding that desperation could drive people to make choices they never thought they were capable of. But a larger part of me remained focused on the fact that she had been willing to sacrifice our children's well-being for money, and that kind of betrayal wasn't something that could be easily forgiven or forgotten. In the end, I decided not to respond to the letter directly. Jessica's consequences were the result of her own actions, and while I didn't take pleasure in her suffering, I also didn't feel obligated to provide comfort or absolution. My energy needed to remain focused on my own family and on ensuring that other families were protected from similar attacks. The policy changes I had advocated for began working their way through the state legislature, with several lawmakers expressing support for stronger penalties for false CPS reports and better oversight of professionals who worked with vulnerable families. It felt good to know that something positive might come from our terrible experience, that other parents might be protected from the kind of nightmare Jessica had tried to put us through. But the most important outcome was the strength our family had discovered through the crisis. Emma and Jake had learned that they could trust their parents to protect them from anyone who tried to harm them, and David and I had learned that we were capable of fighting back when someone threatened what mattered most to us. We were no longer the passive victims of other people's judgments or schemes. We were a family that knew how to stand up for ourselves and each other. As I tucked Jake into bed one night, several months after the whole ordeal had ended, he looked up at me with his serious 5-year-old expression and asked, "Mama, is the mean lady ever coming back?" "No, baby," I told him, smoothing his hair and pulling his blankets up to his chin. The mean lady learned that families who love each other are stronger than people who try to hurt them. We're safe, and we're together, and that's all that matters. Jake nodded solemnly and closed his eyes, secure in the knowledge that his family was a fortress that couldn't be breached by anyone who didn't belong there. And as I watched him drift off to sleep, I felt a deep satisfaction knowing that we had not only survived Jessica's attack but had emerged stronger and more united than ever before. 2 years later, I stood at the podium of the state capitol building, looking out at an audience of lawmakers, child welfare advocates, and families who had experienced similar ordeals. The Family Protection Act was about to be signed into law, establishing mandatory penalties for false CPS reports and creating oversight mechanisms to prevent the abuse of child welfare systems for personal gain. When someone uses the system designed to protect children as a weapon against loving families, I said into the microphone, my voice steady and clear, they're not just harming one household, they're undermining the entire foundation of child protection and wasting resources that could save lives. In the audience, I spotted Sarah Martinez, the caseworker who had handled our investigation with such professionalism and insight. She gave me an encouraging nod, and I remembered how her quick recognition of Jessica's motivations had saved our family from prolonged trauma. After my speech, several legislators approached me with questions about implementation details and enforcement mechanisms. It felt surreal to be consulted as an expert on policy matters, considering that 2 years ago I was just a part-time library worker trying to protect my children from a vindictive relative. Mrs. Patterson, said Senator Williams, the committee chair who had championed the legislation, your advocacy work has been instrumental in bringing this issue to light. Have you considered running for local office? We could use people with your insight and determination. I smiled and shook my head. I'm honored by the suggestion, but my focus needs to remain on my family and the direct advocacy work I'm doing now. The advocacy work had grown beyond anything I could have imagined. After Maria Santos' article about Jessica's case gained national attention, I began receiving calls from families across the country who had experienced similar attacks. Parents who had been falsely reported by ex-spouses during custody battles, grandparents who faced accusations from relatives seeking to control estates, and innocent families targeted by neighbors with personal grudges. I had started a nonprofit organization called Families First Defense, providing support and resources for people navigating false CPS allegations. We offered legal referrals, emotional support, and practical guidance on how to protect yourself and your children during investigations. Most importantly, we worked to identify patterns of abuse in the system and advocate for policy changes to prevent them. The work was demanding but deeply fulfilling. Every family we helped felt like a small victory against the kind of cruelty Jessica had tried to inflict on us. Every policy change we achieved made the system a little bit safer for vulnerable parents who couldn't afford lawyers or didn't know how to navigate bureaucratic complexities.